creeps and grave hunters, and welcome to another episode of Horror History. Today's episode is all about the doctor that we love to hate with the murderous alter ego, Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, before we get into all the historical elements that helped inspire this beloved horror story, go ahead and slaughter that like button like you are a body snatcher trying to get a corpse to sell to a medical school. You may think this episode is going to take you to London, where the story takes place, supposedly. However, it is my goal to convince you the story of Dr. Jekyll and his evil Sorry. I have to sneeze. Sorry. Allergies. Like I was saying, his evil other personality, Mr. Hyde, actually takes place in the author's hometown of Edinburgh, Scotland. But before we get into all of that sexy, spicy jazz, let's indulge in some spirits, shall we? You guys know the drill by now. You've already gone to my Instagram. You've already gotten the recipe for this week's spook tale, and you've already made your cocktail, which means in your hand you also have the resurrection kiss. I really wanted to make a cocktail that was black. I just think it's sexy. There's edible glitter in here. There's an edible flower in here. It's smoky, it's sweet, it's sexy. Let's take a sip. Ching ching. Yes! If that does not bring out your sexy alter ego, I don't know what will. Now on with the show! I usually start my episodes with the backstory or the childhood of the author. But for this particular episode, we have to go way farther back, way before Robert Louis Stevenson was even born, way before he published the book in 1885. We have to go back to 16th century Edinburgh, the ancient land comprised of tons of hardened lava rock from the myriads of ancient volcanoes that used to comprise the area. Like even Edinburgh Castle sits on top of an ancient dormant volcano. Like some 300 million years ago, the damn thing exploded, erupted, and created what they call a tail. So you have the castle and you have this hillside, which Edinburgh sits on top, and you have this kind of spine where they put the Royal Mile High Street down this tail. And in the 1500s, they decided, let's also build a wall around the city. Now they're in this circle, so they can only build so far out horizontally, which means they start building up. Like you have medieval buildings that are 14 stories high. And to put that in perspective, in the 1890s in Chicago, having a 3-story building was like a big deal. So just like wrap your brain around that. There was also this really interesting side effect from having the city within walls. It meant that poor people and the wealthy all had to share the same buildings. So you have this weird social hierarchy when it came to the levels. So at the very top, you would have the wealthy, and the poorer you are, the closer to the ground floor you would be, meaning you were closer to the street, surrounded by sewage, garbage, whatever the upper floors chucked out under the street. It would have smelt wretched. All of this building, though, essentially meant that there was very little room for passage. And what passage you did have and streets you did have were always shrouded in darkness, because it's already Scotland, it's already mainly overcast, and now you have all of the shadow coming from these buildings. So you have these tiny little passageways where you could like hold out your arms and touch both sides, and have these dark alleyways. And as Stevenson describes in his novel about the alleyways that Mr. Hyde lurks, that there's alleyways where the lanterns are never extinguished because they're always in darkness. So now let's travel to the 18th century, okay? We're time traveling, folks, okay? And the political scene in Edinburgh is tense. So the city decides that they need to do a makeover. They want to have a better name for themselves. They want Edinburgh to be a high society place. So they decide, let's build the city chambers on top of some of these old buildings. And because everything's built out of this super hard lava rock, it's sturdy enough to literally build a giant building on top of existing homes without having to lay a different foundation. What this effectively did, though, was displace the top floors of buildings. So the wealthy were now without a home, but all of the lower levels, the poor people, stayed. So when once they could look outside their window and see outside, they now see a dark passageway. The best example of this would be Mary King's Close, which is a street that sits right underneath, I think, like the treasury of the city chambers. And it's completely in darkness, and it became this hotbed of debaucherous activity, crime, because it was dark and creepy, and the poor stayed there. What happens in darkness stays in darkness. You know what I mean? It's also at this time that Edinburgh holds a contest for an architect to design a suburb on the other side of the hill, the uninhabited side of Edinburgh, for the wealthy. And when it's built, you essentially have a city split in two. You have New Town and Old Town, and anybody that could leave Old Town and move to New Town would. It was for the wealthy, it was for the aristocrats. And instantly, in a very short period of time, you have these two sides of a city connected by bridges, and it's split in two. You have the mighty rich over here and the poorest of poor. And this duality in the city is something that Stevenson became obsessed with. In fact, he studied it with scientific detail. And it is in one of these nice suburbs that Robert Louis Stevenson grew up. Although he was a very sickly boy as a child, whether it be scarlet fever or, bronchitis, whatever, he wasn't out playing with his friends. He was usually in his top floor bedroom, either looking out his window or bedridden. But when he is looking out his window, he is looking out from Newtown into Old Town, into the criminal, unsavory Old Town. And we know Stevenson was obsessed with Old Town because he wrote an entire guidebook about it. He literally dedicated an entire book to describing the many characteristics of the buildings and the documenting the darkness of certain alleyways and staircases and creepy vaults and passages, something he also goes into great detail in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He says it's based in London. However, historians know that Stevenson spent little to no time in London and certainly had no idea of the geography of the land the way he did of Edinburgh. I mean, he had it documented like a scientific journal. This guy was obsessed with it. So you have to ask yourself, if he lives and grew up in Edinburgh and he's obsessed with the city and that's absolutely a huge inspiration for Jekyll and Hyde, why does he say it's in London? London sells money. Literally, people would rather read a book set in London than in Scotland, especially in the 1800s. So it wasn't because he had this affinity for London or this thing actually happened in London. He was just trying to make a buck. But it's not just the duality of the city that would inspire him to write the story of a doctor that invents this potion that lets him turn into another personality to indulge his murderous fantasies. There's a huge argument to be made that a lot of the gaps were filled in from many historical figures from Edinburgh. The first of which is a folk hero named Deacon Brodie, a man very much of two different personalities, and a man that he loved hearing stories about when he was sick in bed. So Deacon Brodie was, during the daytime, this town councilman, and he lived in the nice part of town, and he was respected by everybody. But at night, his little inner demon came out, and he would partake in gambling, and he was a cheat. And sometimes he would get in fights because he liked to brawl. And ironically enough, one of his favorite places to get into this debaucherous behavior was at Mary King's Close. Well, as most criminals find out, the law caught up with him. He was arrested and sentenced to death for exactly what, I'm not 100% sure, probably gambling, cheating, whatever. And he's imprisoned at the old jail called the Toll Booth in the middle of town, set to be executed. And this is kind of where his infamy comes in, because apparently, as the legend goes, he had created some kind of apparatus that he would wear underneath his clothes. And the story says that he bribed the executioner to help him with this ploy to wear this thing. So when the noose was put on his neck, he didn't actually die. However, it didn't work, and it was a really slow, atrocious death, because at that time in Scotland, you didn't have the long drop where the neck would break when they would, open the little gates door. This was just like, they kicked the stool out and you're just dangling there, strangling to death, for like the better part of an hour. And like 20,000 people watched this happen. And because Scotland knows what's up and they give the people what they want, they had just recently elevated the gallows so more people could have a good view from anywhere of the person dying. But he is not the only one that inspired Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, even though, he was a man of split personality. And Stevenson talked about wanting to write a story about him. However, he did not think that it was proper to have a character with two such opposing personalities have the same name. So he would give them two names. Are we watching all the things click in place? Because I think we are. But we need to talk about a couple other people to round out the story. If you are a historical true crime fan like I am, then you should definitely know the names William Blake and William Hare, or Burke and Hare as they're more affectionately known. A couple of Irishmen that found their way to Edinburgh to make it rich in the corpse trade. See, Edinburgh, especially at this time, was like the medical center of the world, and definitely in Scotland. They are in the forefront for surgeons, anatomy. If you took the profession seriously, you were going to Edinburgh, you were going to medical school, and you were going to be a great surgeon. But here's the rub. In order to learn anatomy, in order to learn surgery, you need cadavers to work on, and they consistently found themselves in shortage of bodies. So body snatchers, or resurrection men as they are sometimes called, took it upon themselves to supply the demand of corpses. So the way they would do it is they would usually sneak into a graveyard at night, find the fresh grave, they'd have some meat hooks and they would dig in the fresh grave, take the meat hook, get it in the corpse's nostril, yank them out, and, sell them to a doctor or a medical student. Not a great way to make a living. However, it made them some good money. I mean, at the time, in today's dollars, you could get like $500 for a corpse. So, they were paying. This was so common. Grave robbing was so common in Edinburgh that they actually had to start building walls around the graveyards and putting in watchtowers. It's like basically a prison. It was like a prison for the dead. In fact, if you were wealthy enough, you could pay for a mortise lock, which is just like a grave cage. Like there's a little cage on your grave. And this macabre trade definitely utilized the dark passages and vaults of Old Town. I mean, in fact, there was a tunnel that ran underneath Infirmary Street, which you can assume safely went to the medical school, where people said a lot of these dealings took place. Like these, in the middle of the night, like here's this little baby body. That's messed up. But you get the deal. This was a very common practice in Edinburgh. And Burke and Hare heard of it and were like, haha, we's gonna make some money. However, Burke and Hare weren't interested in grave robbing. Instead, they had a different idea. They basically decided, hey, let's just find like a really old poor person, or maybe a prostitute, or like a disabled kid, and we'll tell them that we have a nice place that they can spend the night and they can have all the drink they want. And they would take them back and sit them by the fire and give them drink after drink after drink until they were so pissed they couldn't fight back. Now, at this point, Hare would hold the person down while Burke executed them. And the way he did it was not with a knife, gun, little shank, a little noose, none of that. No, he did it with 3 fingers. And how he did it was he took 2 fingers and he put them in the nostrils, took this one, clamped it here, and just held them shut until the person died after a few minutes. Horrible. However, where the ingenious part comes in is they were left with a clean body and no real signs of what killed them. And it worked. I mean, over the course of 18 months, they killed and sold 17 bodies. 17 bodies to one doctor and one doctor alone. Enter Dr. Knox, okay? And this is fascinating. Dr. Knox was a super well-respected surgeon. Like 500 plus students would crowd in his anatomy theater just to see him work. And here's the interesting part. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the doctor lives in a surgeon's square in a old place that a well-respected surgeon had once lived, and it had an anatomy theater in the back. Well, what's fascinating about this is Dr. Knox lived in a surgeon's square, and he definitely, in fact, had an anatomy theater. And to continue on our hypothesis of this being an inspiration for Stevenson, in the book, you always have Mr. Hyde kind of sneaking out the back door of the anatomy theater. In real life, Dr. Knox always had Burke and Hare enter through the back door of the anatomy theater. Do you see how these things are starting to line up? Because I definitely do. Perhaps one of the reasons why Stevenson was so inspired by this story was really because the duality it showcased in not just the city he lived, but the society he was a part of. So when Burke and Hare sold Dr. Knox the body of a prostitute, a medical assistant and a few other of the students recognized the prostitutes because they had been with her a couple days earlier. So they wanted to know, like, what the hell happened? Why did she die? And when Burke was questioned on this, he was just kind of like, I don't know. I mean, she was a drunk, and like, you know, these things happen to drunk people. It is what it is. That raised some red flags, and that led them to Hare, who, when questioned, sang like a freaking canary. Like, my God, the man spilled. And he spilled to get immunity. So, because of that, obviously, Burke was arrested, tried, admitted to murders, found guilty for murders, and executed. Here's the fascinating, beautiful, ironic life twist here, is when he died after being executed, his body was promptly taken to the medical school, and he was treated with the same love and affection as all of his victims, except in this instance, his skin was removed, tanned, turned to leather, and was used to bind books and journals. And if anybody has a lead on where I can buy one of those, because apparently there's some in circulation, let me know. Now, of course, because this city is all about duality, Dr. Knox got off free, despite the fact that he was the one buying these murdered corpses and never stopped to question, like, how are you coming amongst all of these dead bodies that aren't injured and we don't know what's wrong with them? No, he just took it, okay? He was a man of profession. He was a man of Newtown. He was well respected, but the man was just as guilty as Burke and Hare. Mark my words. I hope now you guys can see why Stevenson didn't have to imagine a world in London when he had so much in his own backyard to pull from. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of the greatest horror stories of all time. It's the original allegory of how there's good and evil in all of us, and it's a concept that has terrified people for generations. And without Jekyll and Hyde, we wouldn't have people like Hannibal Lecter. I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson didn't invent the serial killer, but he sure as hell was the first one to give it two names. So thanks, guys. Thank you for working with me on my little personality change. Thanks for suggesting I do Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I love horror. I love sharing the history of horror with you guys. I can't wait to see what you guys vote on next week. And if you want to be a part of the voting process, follow me on Instagram. The polls should be going up this weekend, and I'm so excited to keep sharing spooky, creepy history with you guys. Till next week, chin chin.